The moment I opened my eyes to that crisp autumn morning in 1982, I knew something had torn through the fabric of reality itself. The weight of 40 years of suffocating marriage, of being dismissed as just David's wife, of watching my dreams crumble into dust, while he built monuments to his own brilliance. All of it crashed into my consciousness, like a freight train carrying decades of suppressed rage. But here I was, 20 years old again, standing at the crossroads where my life had first gone wrong, and this time, I would burn every bridge that led back to him. The university campus stretched before me like an untouched canvas, morning dew. Still clinging to the grass where students hurried past with backpacks slung over shoulders, and futures bright in their eyes. I could smell the familiar mixture of coffee from the campus cafe, and the musty scent of old textbooks that would soon fill lecture halls. My hands young again, smooth again, free of the wedding ring that had felt like a shackle for decades trembled. As I realized the impossible truth, I had been given something rarer than the rarest gem, a second chance to rewrite the story of Lynn Parker. In my previous life, this very day had been when David Grant first approached me outside the geology building, his confident smile and easy charm making him seem like everything a young woman could want in a partner. He had been 23 then, already showing the signs of the respected expert he would become. The way he spoke about rock formations and mineral deposits with passionate intensity, the way other students looked at him with admiration, the way professors nodded approvingly when he contributed to discussions. I had been drawn to that confidence like a moth to flame, never realizing that flames consume everything that comes too close. But now, with 40 years of hindsight burning in my chest, I could see through every layer of his practiced charm. I remembered how he had positioned himself perfectly in my path that day, how his accidental encounter had been anything but accidental, how he had already done his research on the quiet girl from the small town whose father owned a modest but profitable general store. David Grant had never fallen in love with Lynn Parker. He had identified a suitable investment opportunity and had simply executed his acquisition strategy with the precision of a geological survey. The memory of our wedding day flashed through my mind like a knife twist. How small I had felt in that borrowed white dress. How his colleagues had spoken round me rather than to me. How even on what should have been the happiest day of my life, I had somehow felt like an accessory to David's growing reputation rather than his chosen partner. The reception had been filled with conversations about his research, his publications, his promising career. Well, I had smiled and nodded and played the role of the supportive wife who was just grateful to be included in such an important man's life. 40 years. 40 years of dinner parties where I served food and listened to geological theories, while my own thoughts went unheard and unasked. 40 years of David's colleagues addressing him directly even when asking questions about our home, our schedule, our life together, as if I were merely an extension of his domestic arrangements rather than a person with my own mind and opinions. 40 years of watching him build a career that took him to conferences in exotic locations while I stayed home, maintaining the perfect household that allowed him to focus on his important work. 40 years of feeling myself shrink smaller and smaller until I had nearly disappeared entirely, existing only as a footnote in the great story of Dr. David Grant's professional achievements. The worst part hadn't been the neglect, it had been the way he had convinced me that this was love, that his success was our success, that my sacrifice was not just necessary, but noble. He had been a master at making me feel grateful for scraps of attention, guilty for wanting more than he was prepared to give, selfish for even contemplating a life beyond the carefully constructed boundaries he had established around our marriage. Every time I had mentioned wanting to go back to school, to travel, to pursue interests of my own, he had found ways to redirect the conversation back to his needs, his career, his vision for our future together. And in my previous life, I had died first, suddenly, and without warning. leaving David free to grieve publicly while privately preparing to marry the research assistant, who had been waiting in the wings for years. I had watched from whatever place the dead observed the living, as he had played the role of devoted widower for exactly 6 months, before announcing his engagement to Sarah Chen, a brilliant young woman who shared his passion for geological formations, and who would never dream of asking him to consider her own ambitions as worthy of equal attention. But death, it seemed, had not been the end of my story after all. Whatever force governs the universe had apparently decided that Lynn Parker deserved better than to fade away as a cautionary tale about women who lose themselves in other people's dreams. I had been given this impossible gift, this chance to return to the moment when everything had started going wrong and to choose a different path entirely. The physics of it made no sense, of course. I was 20 years old again, standing in 1982 with full knowledge of events that wouldn't happen for decades, carrying memories of technologies that didn't exist yet, and experiences that now belong to a timeline I was determined to prevent. But sense had never been my strong suit anyway, according to David. I had always been too emotional, too impractical, too focused on feelings rather than facts. Well, now I would show him exactly how practical a woman scorned could be when she put her mind to it. I could see him across the quad even now. That familiar tall figure with dark hair and broad shoulders that had once made my heart race with excitement and possibility. He was walking with that confident stride that had always suggested he knew exactly where he was going and why his destination mattered more than anyone else's. In just a few minutes, if I followed the script of my previous life, he would approach me with that charming smile and those penetrating eyes and begin the careful process of drawing me into his orbit like a planet captured by a star's gravitational pull. But I had already decided that Lynn Parker was done being anyone's satellite. This time, I would be my own sun, burning bright and independent, creating my own light rather than reflecting someone else's. The very thought of it sent electricity through my veins, a sensation I hadn't felt in decades, the pure, intoxicating thrill of possibility stretching out before me like an endless highway. I turned deliberately away from David's approaching figure and walked in the opposite direction, toward the student housing office where I knew destiny was waiting in a different form entirely. My heart pounded with each step, not from fear, but from exhilaration. Every footfall was taking me further from the life that had nearly destroyed me, and closer to whatever new story I was about to write. The morning air tasted different when you weren't walking toward your own prison sentence. I realized it tasted like freedom, sharp and clean and full of infinite potential. The student housing office buzzed with activity as young people searched for roommates and living arrangements for the coming semester. I had never lived with anyone except my family. And then David Dye had gone straight from my father's protective home to my husband's controlled environment without ever experiencing the messy, complicated, wonderful independence of figuring out life on my own terms. But now, scanning the bulletin board filled with handwritten notes and typed announcements, I felt like an explorer discovering a new continent. That's when I saw her posting Megan Lane, looking for a roommate to share a small off-campus apartment. Someone responsible and quiet who wouldn't mind sharing cooking duties and keeping reasonable hours. In my previous life, I had never met Megan Lane. She had been just another face in the crowd of students whose paths had never crossed mine, because David had so quickly and completely reorganized my social world around his own needs and connections. But something about her straightforward posting, free of the pretentious language and academic posturing that characterized so many of the other notices, appealed to me immediately. I found her phone number at the bottom of the posting and decided to call that very afternoon. If I was going to rewrite my story, I might as well start with the most basic element where and with whom I would live, while I figured out who Lynn Parker could become when she wasn't constantly shrinking to fit into the spaces other people left for her. The thought of having a roommate, of navigating the ordinary challenges of shared living space and negotiated responsibilities filled me with a nervous excitement I hadn't felt since childhood. These were the experiences I had missed, the growing pains I had never been allowed to endure, because David had so efficiently smoothed all the rough edges from my life, while simultaneously removing all the interesting parts. But even as I copied down Megan's information and planned my afternoon phone call, I could feel eyes watching me from across the room. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see, and there he was, David Grant, standing in the doorway of the student housing office with an expression of confusion and something that might have been hurt pride crossing his handsome features. He had clearly followed me here, probably expecting to find me waiting where he had left me in his previous timeline, ready to fall into step with his carefully orchestrated plan for our meet-cute. Instead, he had found me actively pursuing a life that had nothing to do with him, and I could see him struggling to process this deviation from the script we had apparently both been following in some other version of reality. For a moment, our eyes met across the crowded room, and I felt the strangest sensation, as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which version of our story would win the right to continue existing. In my previous life, this look would have melted my resistance like snow in sunshine. David had always been devastatingly handsome when he was slightly confused and vulnerable, and I had always been a sucker for the wounded puppy expression that suggested I could be the one to heal whatever was troubling him. I had spent 40 years learning that David Grant's vulnerability was just another tool in his arsenal, deployed strategically whenever his more direct methods of getting what he wanted proved insufficient. This time, I held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to let him know that I saw him and recognized him and was choosing to dismiss him anyway. Then I turned back to the bulletin board as if he were just another stranger in a room full of people who had nothing to do with my future. The deliberate nature of this snub sent a clear message that I was no longer the impressionable young woman he had targeted for acquisition. I was something else entirely now, something he had never encountered before and was therefore completely unprepared to handle. I could feel him hovering in the doorway for several more minutes, probably, waiting for me to glance back and give him the opening he needed to approach and initiate whatever charm offensive he had prepared for this moment. But I kept my attention focused on the bulletin board, reading every posting with apparent fascination, making notes in a small notebook I had brought, behaving like someone who had important business to conduct and no time for casual interruptions from handsome strangers. Finally, I heard his footsteps retreating, and I allowed myself a small smile of triumph. Round 1 to Lynn Parker, the new and improved version. I had successfully avoided the gravitational pull that had trapped me for decades in my previous existence. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. David Grant had not become a respected expert in his field by giving up easily. When his initial approach failed to yield the desired results, he would regroup, reassess, and return with a different strategy, and I needed to be ready for him. The call to Megan Lane that afternoon went better than I had dared to hope. Her voice was warm and practical, without the affected sophistication that characterized so many of the other students I had encountered during my brief time on campus. She asked reasonable questions about my habits and preferences, offered honest information about the apartment and the neighborhood, and suggested we meet for coffee the next day to see if we would be compatible as roommates. It was such a normal, healthy interaction to young women negotiating the terms of a potential friendship, based on mutual respect and shared needs rather than one person calculating how the other might be useful to their larger ambitions. We agreed to meet at the campus coffee shop at 2 o'clock, and I spent the rest of the evening planning what I would wear, what I would say, how I would present myself as the kind of person Megan Lane would want to live with. This was entirely new territory for me. In my previous life, David had appeared so quickly and completely in my world that I had never needed to develop the skills of making friends as an adult. His social circle had become my social circle. His interests had shaped my interests. His calendar had determined how I spent my time. I had friends, of course, but they had all been wives of David's colleagues. Women I had been thrown together with by circumstance rather than choice. And our relationships had been built around our shared experience of being married to important men rather than any genuine compatibility or mutual affection. But now I would need to learn how to be a friend to someone who knew nothing about my previous life. Someone who would judge me based on who I was in this moment rather than how well I complimented someone else's achievements. The prospect was both terrifying and exhilarating. What if I discovered that without David's reflected glory, I was actually quite boring? What if 40 years of suppressed personality had left me with no personality at all? What if I had become so accustomed to agreeing with other people's opinions that I no longer had any opinions of my own? These fears kept me awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom and listening to the familiar sounds of my father moving around downstairs, probably working on the books for his general store or reading one of the mystery novels he enjoyed in the quiet hours after closing time. My father had been disappointed when I announced my intention to marry David Grant instead of pursuing my education, though he had been too kind and too respectful of my choices to say so directly. He had simply offered his support and his blessing, trusting that I knew what would make me happy even when I clearly didn't have the first idea about what happiness might look like. For someone like me in this timeline, my father was still alive, still healthy, still running his store with the quiet competence that had made him a respected member of our small community. I realized that I now had the opportunity to be a different kind of daughter to him, one who didn't disappoint him by choosing security over possibility. One who didn't abandon him to build a life with a man who would never truly appreciate the sacrifice that choice represented. The thought of having more time with my father, of being able to show him that his faith in my potential had not been misplaced, brought tears to my eyes that I hadn't shed in decades. The next morning arrived, gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made everything look slightly melancholy and uncertain. I dressed carefully in jeans and a simple sweater, aiming for an appearance that suggested I was serious, but not trying too hard, mature but not old-fashioned. Someone who could be trusted with shared responsibilities, but who also might be interesting, enough to spend time with by choice rather than obligation. As I walked across campus toward the coffee shop, I found myself unconsciously scanning the crowds for David's familiar figure, wondering if he would make another attempt to intercept me before I could continue building this alternative life. The coffee shop was warm and crowded, filled with students hunched over textbooks and couples sharing quiet conversations over steaming mugs. I arrived a few minutes early and claimed a small table near the window where I could watch for Megan while also keeping an eye on the door in case David decided to make an appearance. The normalcy of it all struck me as almost magical, the ability to sit in a public place without wondering if my presence there would somehow inconvenience someone more important, without calculating whether my choice of seating or beverage or facial expression might reflect poorly on my husband's reputation. Megan arrived precisely on time, a tall girl with curly red hair and freckles, wearing a practical wool coat and carrying a canvas bag that looked like it had seen considerable use. She had an open, friendly face that suggested she was someone who said what she meant and meant what she said, without the layers of social calculation that I had grown so accustomed to navigating in David's academic circles. When she smiled and waved from the doorway, I felt an immediate sense of relief. This was someone I could imagine talking to honestly, someone who wouldn't require me to perform a carefully curated version of myself in order to earn her approval. We ordered coffee and settled into our chairs, and for the first time in decades, I found myself in a conversation that was entirely about the present moment, rather than some larger agenda or long-term strategy. Megan told me about her major in social work, her plans to help children from troubled families, her concerns about finding affordable housing near campus. I shared my own uncertainties about my academic direction, my desire for independence, my willingness to contribute equally to household expenses and responsibilities. It was such a relief to be having a conversation where both participants were equally important, where neither person was auditioning for the role of supportive background character in someone else's story. We had been talking for about 20 minutes when I saw him approaching through the window. David Grant, walking with that same confident stride, but with an expression that suggested he was not entirely pleased with how recent events had been unfolding. He paused just outside the coffee shop, clearly debating whether to enter, and I found myself holding my breath as I waited to see what he would decide. Megan, following my gaze, asked if I knew the man who seemed to be staring at our table with such intensity. No, I said firmly, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I don't know him at all. And it was true. I realized the David Grant I had been married to for 40 years had been a carefully constructed facade, a performance designed to win admiration and compliance rather than genuine intimacy or understanding. I had never known the real David Grant, and now I never would. This realization brought with it a sense of liberation that was almost dizzying in its intensity. David seemed to sense the finality of my rejection even through the coffee shop window. He stood there for another moment, his handsome face cycling through expressions of confusion, frustration, and something that might have been genuine hurt. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of students without making any attempt to approach or confront me. I felt a surge of triumph mixed with an unexpected twinge of sympathy. In this timeline, he was probably genuinely confused by my behavior, unable to understand why the carefully researched target of his romantic ambitions was refusing to follow the script he had written for both of us. But my sympathy was quickly overwhelmed by a much stronger emotion, pure, undiluted relief. I was free. For the first time in my adult life, I was sitting in a coffee shop having a normal conversation with a potential friend, and no one was trying to manage my choices or redirect my energy toward their own priorities. The sensation was so unfamiliar that it took me a moment to recognize it as happiness. The simple joy of being exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I wanted to do, without needing to justify or explain or apologize for my presence in my own life. Megan and I talked for another hour, and by the time we parted ways, we had agreed that I would move into the apartment the following weekend. She gave me her spare key and a list of items we would need to purchase together: sheets for the second bedroom, a few basic kitchen supplies, a small television for the living area. These mundane details filled me with excitement that probably seemed disproportionate to their actual significance. But for someone who had spent for decades having every domestic decision filtered through another person's preferences and priorities, the opportunity to choose my own towels felt like a revolutionary act. That evening, I called my father to tell him about my new living arrangement and my plans to enroll in classes for the spring semester. His voice brightened with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard since but from my wedding day in my previous life. He asked thoughtful questions about my academic interests, offered to help with expenses, suggested that this could be a wonderful opportunity for me to discover what I was truly passionate about pursuing. The contrast with David's typical response to my interest's polite dismissal disguised as practical concern was so stark that I found myself blinking back tears of gratitude. "I'm proud of you, Lynn," my father said as we were ending our conversation. "I know this takes courage, starting over like this, but I have a feeling you're going to surprise yourself with what you're capable of achieving." His words stayed with me long after we hung up, like a warm light in a room that had been dark for too long. In my previous life, I had spent so many years trying to earn David's approval that I had forgotten how good it felt To have someone believe in me simply because they love me and wanted to see me happy. The weekend of my move arrived crisp and clear, with the kind of bright autumn sunshine that makes everything seem possible. My father drove up from our hometown in his old pickup truck, the bed loaded with my belongings, which, I realized with some embarrassment, weren't very extensive. 40 years of marriage had somehow left me with very few possessions that I thought of as truly mine rather than ours. But now I would have the chance to accumulate objects that reflected my own taste and interests, rather than their compatibility with someone else's vision of our shared aesthetic. Megan was waiting when we arrived, and she immediately charmed my father with her genuine warmth and practical approach to helping us unload boxes and furniture. I watched them interact and realized that this was what normal looked like people. Being kind to each other because kindness cost nothing and made everything easier rather than because they were calculating the potential benefits of making a good impression. My father helped us arrange the furniture in my new bedroom, and I could see him mentally cataloging the safety of the neighborhood, the character of my new roommate, the general atmosphere of independence and possibility that surrounded this new chapter of my life. As he was preparing to leave, my father pulled me aside for a quiet conversation. "You seem different, Lynn," he said, studying my face with the careful attention that had made him successful in business. "Happier, somehow, more like yourself than you seemed in a while." I realized that in this timeline, I hadn't yet made the choice to disappear into David Grant's shadow, which meant my father was seeing me as I had been before I learned to make myself smaller and quieter and more convenient for other people to manage. I felt different, I admitted, like I'm finally ready to figure out who I'm supposed to be. He nodded as if this made perfect sense, kissed my forehead, and told me to call if I needed anything. Watching his truck disappear down the street, I felt the last threads connecting me to my previous life finally snap. I was Lynn Parker again, but this time I would be Lynn Parker on my own terms. Living with Megan turned out to be exactly the education in normal human relationships that I had never realized I needed. She was considerate without being anxious about it, responsible without being controlling, friendly without requiring constant emotional maintenance. She had her own interests and ambitions that she pursued with quiet determination, and she expected the same independence from me. It was such a relief to be around someone who didn't need me to be anything other than a decent roommate and a reasonably interesting person to share meals and conversations with occasionally. We fell into comfortable routines over the next few weeks. I enrolled in a full course load for the spring semester, choosing classes based on my own curiosity rather than their potential usefulness to someone else's career. Megan and I took turns cooking dinner and discovered that we both enjoyed experimenting with recipes from different countries. We studied together in the evenings sometimes, not because we were taking the same classes, but because the companionable silence of shared focus created an atmosphere that helped both of us concentrate on our individual work. It was during one of these quiet study sessions that David Grant made his next move. We were sitting at our small kitchen table, Megan working on a paper about child psychology and me reading about art history, when the phone rang. Megan answered and handed it to me with a puzzled expression. "It's for you," she said. "Someone who says he knows you from campus." The moment I heard David's voice, I felt my entire body tense with recognition and revulsion. 40 years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. And some part of me was still programmed to respond to his particular combination of charm and authority with automatic compliance. But I forced myself to remember what I knew about this man, what he had done to me in my previous life, what he was trying to do to me now. "Lynn, I've been trying to reach you," he said, his voice carrying that particular blend of hurt and confusion that had always made me feel guilty for not being more available to him. "I thought we had made a connection when we met on campus, but then you seemed to disappear. I was worried that something might have happened to you." The audacity of it took my breath away in this timeline. We had never actually met. I had deliberately avoided him and refused his attempts at eye contact. But somehow, he was constructing a narrative in which we had shared some meaningful encounter that gave him the right to track down my phone number and demand explanations for my subsequent behavior. It was such a perfect example of the way David Grant rewrote reality to suit his own needs that I almost admired the skill involved, even as it made me want to throw the phone across the room. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice as neutral and uninterested as possible. "But I think you have me confused with someone else. We haven't met." I could hear him take a sharp breath on the other end of the line, clearly not expecting this response. In his previous experience with me, I had never directly contradicted him or refused to participate in his version of events, even when that version bore no resemblance to my own memories or feelings. "Of course we've met," he said, and I could hear the edge of frustration creeping into his voice. "You were at the student housing office last month, looking at the bulletin board. We made eye contact. I could tell you recognized me." The fact that he was right about the eye contact made his claims sound just plausible enough to be unsettling. But I had already decided that Lynn Parker version 2.0 would not be intimidated by David Grant's manipulative reconstructions of reality. "I look at a lot of people on campus," I said calmly. "That doesn't mean I know them or want to know them. I'm not interested in whatever you're trying to accomplish with this phone call. And I'd appreciate it if you didn't contact me again." Before he could respond, I hung up and immediately turned to Megan, who was watching this exchange with obvious concern. "Ex-boyfriend?" she asked gently, and I realized that from her perspective, this probably looked like a fairly typical case of someone having trouble accepting the end of a relationship. How could I possibly explain that the man on the phone had been my husband for 40 years in a timeline that no longer existed? That he was somehow trying to recreate a marriage that had already destroyed me once? That his persistence wasn't romantic, but predatory? "Something like that," I said, which was both true and completely inadequate. "He's having trouble taking no for an answer." Megan nodded with the kind of understanding that suggested she had either experienced or witnessed this kind of harassment before, and I felt grateful once again for her practical approach to human problems. She didn't press for details or offer unwanted advice. She simply accepted that I was dealing with an unwanted admirer and trusted that I would handle it appropriately. But David Grant was not prepared to accept my rejection as the final word on our relationship. Over the next few weeks, he began appearing in places where I was likely to be: the library, the campus bookstore, the coffee shop where Megan and I had first met. He never approached me directly, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He would position himself where I couldn't help but see him, then watch me with an expression of hurt confusion that suggested I was behaving unreasonably. By continuing to ignore his obvious interest in renewing our connection, the stalking behavior escalated gradually, in ways that were clearly calculated to stay just within the bounds of what might be dismissed as coincidental encounters. He started showing up at the apartment building across from mine, claiming to be visiting friends who lived there. He began frequenting the small grocery store where Megan and I did our weekly shopping. He enrolled in an art history class that he had no academic reason to take, solely because he had somehow discovered it was one of my favorite courses. Each encounter left me feeling more trapped and angry, not just because of his current behavior, but because of the memories it triggered of all the ways he had controlled and monitored my life. In our previous marriage, David Grant had always been a master at making his surveillance seem like devotion. His possessiveness seemed like protection. His manipulation seemed like love. But now I could see these tactics for what they really were: the calculated moves of someone who viewed other people as objects to be acquired and managed, rather than individuals with their own rights and desires. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday evening in November. Megan and I were walking home from the library when David stepped out of the shadows near our apartment building, clearly having waited for us to return. His presence there, in the space I had begun to think of as safe and private, felt like a violation that went beyond mere annoyance into something actively threatening. "Lynn, we need to talk," he said, moving to block our path to the front door. Up close, I could see that he looked haggard, as if the stress of my continued rejection was taking a physical toll. But instead of making me feel sympathetic, this evidence of his distress only made me angrier. In my previous life, I had spent decades absorbing David's emotional states as if they were my responsibility, managing his moods and needs as if my own feelings were irrelevant by comparison. I was not about to repeat that pattern now. "No, we don't," I said firmly, stepping closer to Megan in a clear signal that she should stay alert. "I've told you repeatedly that I'm not interested in talking to you or having any kind of relationship with you. This is harassment, and if you don't stop, I'm going to call the police." David's face went through a series of rapid changes, cycling from surprise to hurt to anger, and back to the wounded confusion that he clearly expected would soften my resolve. "You can't possibly mean that," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of pained disbelief that had always made me question my own perceptions in our previous life. "I know you remember what we had together. I know you felt the connection between us. You can't just pretend that never happened." And there it was, the confirmation I had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. Somehow, David Grant retained memories of our previous life together, our 40-year marriage, our shared history that had been erased when I chose a different path. The knowledge that he was experiencing the same temporal displacement that had given me this second chance made everything infinitely more complicated and dangerous. If he remembered being married to me, if he retained all his expectations and assumptions about our relationship, then my rejection wasn't just disappointing to him, it was a fundamental violation of what he believed to be the natural order of things. But even as this realization sent chills down my spine, it also filled me with a fierce determination that surprised me with its intensity. David Grant might remember being married to me, but he had clearly learned nothing from that experience about who I really was, or what I actually wanted. He was still approaching me as if I were a problem to be solved or an asset to be recovered rather than a person with my own agency and desires. If anything, his presumption that our previous relationship gave him some kind of claim on my future made his behavior even more inexcusable. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, looking directly into his eyes with all the conviction I could muster. "We have never had any kind of relationship. We are strangers, and I want to keep it that way. If you continue to follow me or contact me or show up where I live, I will file a restraining order against you." The words felt powerful as they left my mouth, like weapons I had never known I possessed. David stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling to process this level of resistance from someone who had spent for decades deferring to his judgment about everything from major life decisions to what we should have for dinner. I could see him mentally recalibrating, trying to find a new strategy that would work on this version of Lynn Parker, who refused to acknowledge his authority over her choices. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, his voice low and carrying an undertone of threat that made Megan step closer to me in unconscious solidarity. "You belong with me, Lynn. You know that. This rebellion, this pretending we don't have a history, it's not going to work. I won't let you destroy what we have together just because you're scared of commitment." The psychological manipulation in his words was so blatant and familiar that I almost laughed. This was David Grant's standard playbook: reframe any resistance to his desires as evidence of the other person's emotional instability, suggest that their objections stemmed from fear rather than legitimate grievances, position himself as the stable, reasonable party who was patiently enduring their irrational behavior. I had fallen for these tactics for 40 years in my previous life, allowing him to convince me that my own feelings and instincts were unreliable guides to my own best interests. "Megan, call the police," I said without taking my eyes off David's face. The shock of this direct escalation clearly caught him off guard. He had probably expected me to continue engaging with his arguments, trying to justify my position or defend my right to reject him. Instead, I had simply bypassed his entire rhetorical strategy and moved directly to consequences. "Wait," he said quickly, raising his hands in a gesture that was probably meant to look placating, but actually made him appear more threatening. "There's no need for that. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I just want to talk to you, to help you understand what you're giving up by running away from what we could have together." But I was done listening to David Grant explain what I should want or feel or understand. I had wasted 40 years of my previous life allowing him to be the expert on my own emotions and desires, accepting his interpretations of my behavior even when they contradicted my direct experience of my own inner world. This time, I would trust my own perceptions and my own judgment about what was best for my life. "Go home, David," I said, using his name for the first time in this timeline and watching his face light up with pathetic hope at this acknowledgement of his identity. "Find someone else to project your fantasies onto. I am not interested in being whatever you think you need me to be." Then I took Megan's arm and walked past him to our front door, my heart pounding but my steps steady and sure. Inside the apartment, Megan immediately deadbolted the door and moved to the window to see if David was still lurking outside. "That was intense," she said, her voice shaky but admirationally steady. "You handled that really well, but I think we should definitely keep an eye out for him. That guy has some serious boundary issues." I nodded, grateful for her support, but also aware that I couldn't explain the true extent of David's obsession with me without sounding completely insane. How could I tell her that his boundary issues stem from 40 years of marriage in an alternate timeline where I had been conditioned to accept his control as natural and appropriate? How could I describe the way his presence made me feel not just threatened by his current behavior, but actively claustrophobic from the weight of memories that belonged to a life I was determined never to live again? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to process the implications of David's apparent retention of memories from our previous life together. If he remembered being married to me, did he also remember how that marriage had ended? Did he know that I had died first, leaving him free to marry his research assistant? Or was his memory selective, filtered through the same self-serving lens that had allowed him to convince himself that 40 years of emotional neglect had actually been love? The weeks that followed brought an escalating campaign of harassment that confirmed my worst fears about David's mental state. He began leaving flowers at our apartment door, with notes that referenced conversations we had never had in this timeline. He started showing up at my father's store, 3 hours away, spinning elaborate stories about being my secret boyfriend and asking for permission to propose. Most disturbingly, he began telling people on campus that we were already married, that I was suffering from some kind of mental breakdown that was causing me to forget our relationship. The lies he spread were so specific and detailed that some people actually believed them. He claimed we had eloped over the summer, that the stress of starting college had triggered a psychological episode that was making me deny our marriage. He showed people what he claimed was our wedding photo, though how he had manufactured such convincing evidence remained a mystery that filled me with dread about what other preparations he might have made. The situation reached a crisis point during finals week in December. I was walking across campus late one evening, returning from the library where I had been studying for my art history exam, when David appeared out of nowhere and grabbed my arm with enough force to leave bruises. His eyes were wild with a desperation that went far beyond normal romantic rejection, and I realized that whatever grip on reality he might have maintained was finally slipping completely. "You can't keep pretending," he hissed, his fingers digging into my arm as students walked past us without seeming to notice anything amiss. I won't let you destroy our marriage just because you're having some kind of breakdown. You belong to me, Lynn. You've always belonged to me. And I'm not going to let you forget that again. The word again sent ice through my veins. He definitely remembered our previous life, remembered my death, remembered losing me. But instead of taking that loss as a lesson about what happens when you treat someone like a possession instead of a person, he had apparently decided that this second chance was an opportunity to exert even more control over my choices. The thought of being trapped with him again, of watching myself disappear into his shadow for another 40 years, filled me with a rage so pure it felt like electricity in my blood. Let go of me, I said, my voice carrying a strength I hadn't known I possessed. But David's grip only tightened, and I realized that we had moved beyond the realm of psychological manipulation into something much more dangerous. This was no longer about romance or even obsession. This was about power. And David Grant was not prepared to accept that he had no power over me in this timeline. That's when Zach Morrison appeared, as if summoned by my desperate need for rescue. I had noticed him before he was student council president. The kind of person who seemed to exist at the center of campus social life, without being arrogant about his popularity. He was tall and broad-shouldered like David, but where David's presence felt oppressive and controlling, Zach radiated the kind of easy confidence that came from actually being comfortable with him. Self rather than needing to dominate others too. Feel secure. Is there a problem here? Zach asked, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone that suggested he was prepared to make this David's problem if necessary. I felt David's grip loosen slightly as he registered the threat posed by this witness to his behavior, and I took advantage of his momentary distraction to pull free of his grasp. This man has been stalking me, I said clearly, loud enough that other students passing by couldn't help but hear. He won't accept that I'm not interested in him, and now he's physically restraining me against my will. The public nature of this accusation clearly shocked David, who had probably expected me to minimize the situation or try to handle it privately to avoid causing a scene. Zach stepped between us, his presence creating a physical barrier that gave me space to breathe and think. You need to leave, he told David, his voice still calm, but with an authority that brooked no argument. If you continue to bother this woman, there will be consequences. David looked back and forth between us, his face cycling through expressions of rage and disbelief. You don't understand, he said, addressing Zach as if I weren't even there. She's my wife. She's having some kind of mental episode, but she's my wife. I have every right to talk to her. The lie was so blatant and desperate that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered 40 years of smaller lies, subtler manipulations, the gradual erosion of my sense of reality under the constant pressure of his need to be right about everything. David Grant had spent decades training me to doubt my own perceptions, and now he was trying to use that same strategy on a larger audience. I've never been married to this man, I said firmly, looking directly at the small crowd of students who had gathered to watch this drama unfold. I barely know him. He's been harassing me for months, and now he's apparently having delusions about our relationship. The clinical precision of my language seemed to cut through whatever spell David's desperate performance might have cast, and I could see doubt creeping into the faces of the people who had been listening to his claims. Zach put a protective arm around my shoulders, not possessively, but in clear solidarity, and addressed the crowd. I think everyone should be aware that this man has been making false claims about being married to Lynn Parker. She's asked him repeatedly to leave her alone, and he's continued to stalk and harass her. If anyone sees him bothering her again, please contact campus security immediately. The public nature of this declaration seemed to break something in David's carefully maintained facade. His face twisted with an rage so pure and ugly that several people in the crowd actually stepped backward. You'll regret this, he said, pointing at me with a trembling finger. Both of you will regret this. You can't just walk away from what we have together, Lynn. I won't let you." But even as he made these threats, I could see that his power over me had finally been broken completely. Standing there with Zach's steady presence beside me and a crowd of witnesses who had seen David's true nature revealed, I felt the last chains of my previous life fall away. I was free not just from this particular confrontation, but from the entire system of fear and obligation that had kept me trapped for so long. Campus security arrived within minutes, summoned by someone in the crowd who had called them on a cell phone. David was escorted away, still protesting that he was the victim of some elaborate misunderstanding, that his wife was being manipulated by people who didn't understand the situation. But his protests fell on deaf ears now that his behavior had been witnessed by so many people. Whatever credibility his claims might have had was destroyed by the obvious desperation and instability he had displayed. The aftermath moved quickly. David was banned from campus pending a psychological evaluation, and I was granted a restraining order that prohibited him from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of any place where I lived, worked, or studied. The evaluation revealed what I had already suspected, that David was experiencing a severe break from reality, possibly triggered by stress and exacerbated by his obsessive personality disorder. He was committed to a mental health facility for treatment, and I was finally completely safe from his attempts to reclaim control over my life. With David gone, I threw myself into building the life I had always wanted but never dared to pursue. I finished my degree in art history with honors, discovering that I had a genuine talent for understanding how cultural movements reflected and shaped the societies that created them. I found work at a small gallery in the city, where my enthusiasm and knowledge quickly earned me opportunities to curate exhibitions and work directly with artists whose vision inspired me. Zach, who had become first my protector and then my friend during the difficult months of David's breakdown, gradually became something more. He was everything. David had never been supportive without being controlling, interested in my thoughts and dreams without trying to reshape them to fit his own agenda, confident enough in himself that he didn't need to diminish me to feel important. When he asked me to marry him 2 years later, I said yes without hesitation, knowing that this time I was choosing partnership rather than surrender. My father's business flourished with the advice I was able to give him about expanding into specialty foods and tourist items that appealed to visitors from the city. Megan graduated and went on to do exactly the kind of meaningful work with children that she had always dreamed of, and we remained close friends even as our lives took us in different directions. I arranged for her family to take over my father's expanded business when he decided to retire, ensuring that the shop would continue to serve our community, while giving Megan's parents the financial security they had always worked toward. 10 years later, as I stood in my own gallery surrounded by art that spoke to the complexity and beauty of human experience, I reflected on the strange gift I had been given. The chance to rewrite my story had come at a price. I would always carry the memories of 40 years that had been erased from existence. 40 years of learning what I didn't want through painful experience. But those memories had also given me the wisdom to recognize real love when it appeared, the strength to stand up for myself when threatened, and the clarity to build a life based on my own values, rather than someone else's expectations. David Grant had been released from the mental health facility after 18 months of treatment, and I occasionally heard updates about his life through mutual acquaintances. He had apparently found work as a geology instructor at a small college in another state, where his expertise was valued, but his personal life remained largely solitary. Part of me hoped that his experience of losing control so completely had taught him something about respecting other people's autonomy. But I was grateful that I would never have to find out personally. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I wondered about the mechanics of what had happened to us. Had we both died simultaneously in our previous timeline? creating some kind of temporal ripple that allowed us to return to this crucial moment, with our memories intact. Or was I the only one who had truly been reborn, while David's memories were simply the desperate fantasies of a man who couldn't accept rejection? I would never know for certain, and I had learned to be comfortable with that uncertainty. What mattered was that I had been given the chance to discover who Lynn Parker could become, when she wasn't constantly shrinking to fit into spaces designed for someone else's comfort. I had learned that I was capable of courage, of independence, of building meaningful relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional dependency. I had discovered that my own dreams and ambitions were worthy of pursuit, that my thoughts and feelings were valid and important, that I deserved to be seen and heard and valued for who I truly was. As I turned off the lights in my gallery and walked home to the apartment I shared with Zach, a space that felt like sanctuary rather than prison, I felt profound gratitude for the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. I had been given the rarest of gifts, a second chance, to write my own story. And this time, I had written it in ink that couldn't be erased, with words that belonged entirely to me.